The deed paper snapped in the wind as the man signed it. A deputy named Elias Hobbs stood by the wagon, holding his horse still, watching the transaction the way a person watches something they know is wrong but cannot name. A tin cup sat frozen to the table edge. The mule's breath steamed in the cold. A girl stood beside the wagon in a mitten tied on with feed twine, pressing close to her father's leg, not speaking. The seller folded the deed, looked down at the child, and asked her if she knew what her father had just bought. He said the word grave. Darius Kells arrived in Cheyenne County, Kansas, in the last week of September 1885 with his daughter on the seat beside him, a mule pulling what was left of their life, and $5 in coin wrapped in flour cloth. His wife Etta had died of fever 11 days east of here, buried beside a road that did not have a name, marked with a plank that would not last 2 winters. There was no one to go back to, no family holding a room open, no employer waiting on his return, no town where his name meant credit or shelter. The mule had a swollen shoulder. The girl had a cough that woke her before dawn and kept her sitting upright through the night when the air turned cold. The chest in the wagon held a cross-cut saw with a dull blade, a claw hammer, a hand drill, a draw knife, 3 blankets, and 9 pounds of flour. No nails, no glass, no stovepipe. The one iron stove he owned was missing 2 fire brick, cracked along the firebox seam, and too heavy for the mule to pull much farther. The $5 was everything. Not almost everything. Everything. And Darius had just handed it to Judson Rye. Judson worked as bookkeeper for the Crooked L Cattle Company, but his real trade was paper. He bought tax-soured parcels at auction, held them until someone desperate came through, and sold at whatever price the desperation would carry. The parcel he sold Darius was 40 acres of nothing a cattleman wanted, a narrow strip running along a dry draw that cut 30 feet deep through the prairie, too broken for plowing, too steep for easy grazing, and dangerous when rain fell upstream. Judson sold it for $5 because clearing it from the county ledger saved him $12 in back taxes, and because watching a man with a sick child sign for a death trap amused him in a way he did not bother to hide. Clary was 8. She stood beside the wagon while her father signed the deed, her mitten tied on with feed twine because the button had torn off somewhere in Nebraska. She did not ask what the land looked like. She asked if there was a house. There was no house. There was a draw, a dry wash carved into the plains by water that came fast and left faster, its banks raw dirt and exposed clay, its bottom littered with flood debris and dead cottonwood. Above the draw, the prairie stretched flat and treeless in every direction, the wind crossing it without anything to slow it down. The nearest timber of any size grew along creek bottoms 4 miles south. The nearest town, Benkelman Crossing, sat 9 miles east. The nearest neighbor who might loan a team or share a meal was Lenora Pike, a widow running a sod claim 2 miles north with 2 boys and no patience for strangers. This was home now. Not because Darius chose it, because the $5 was gone and the mule could not carry them farther, and winter in western Kansas did not wait for a man to find something better. 10 weeks. That was the math. 10 weeks until the deep cold settled in. A family needed a tight roof, a working stove, 6 cords of fuel minimum under cover, hay for the mule, and food enough to last until spring. Darius had no roof, a broken stove, less than 1 cord of gathered cottonwood scraps, no hay, and 9 pounds of flour. A conventional frame house required freighted lumber, glass, nails, and hired labor. $200 at the cheapest, more likely $300. Even a proper soddy took weeks of cutting sod bricks, a ridgepole, a sound roof frame, and time he did not have. The Homestead Act promised free land, but free land still demanded fees, improvements, livestock, and 5 years of endurance. Poverty did not disappear because the government waved its hand. And Clary coughed again. A wet sound deep in the chest, the kind that got worse in cold air and killed children in houses with walls. She did not have walls. 3 days after signing the deed, a rider came down the draw trail. Merritt Gann, 55 years old, foreman of the Crooked L Ranch, sat on a dun mare and looked at the draw for a long time before he looked at Darius. Merritt had run cattle on the western Kansas plains for 19 years. He had survived 3 blizzards, 2 droughts, and a grass fire that took 1,100 head in a single afternoon. He knew what winter asked for and what it punished. Darius was stacking cottonwood rounds he had cut from deadfall along the draw bottom. The wood was punky, soft from rot, the kind that burned fast and threw half its heat up the flue before the room caught warm. Merritt watched him work for a minute, then dismounted. "How much you got?" Merritt asked. "Close to a cord," Darius said. He kept stacking. Merritt walked to the pile. He pushed around with his boot and it gave, the bark sloughing off in wet strips. Cottonwood, and green rot at that. He looked up at the open sky, the draw walls, the bare ground where Darius had scraped a flat place for the stove. "Where is your roof?" "Working on it." "Working on it?" Merritt said it flat, the way a man repeats something he does not believe. He looked at the stove sitting on the bare ground, the cracked firebox visible from 10 feet away. He looked at the 3 blankets folded on the wagon seat, and the girl sitting wrapped in one of them, watching. A family needs 6 cords minimum under cover. Good wood, oak, ash, hedge, something that holds heat. You have maybe 3/4 cord of cottonwood that will burn through in a night. You need a tight roof. You have sky. You need a working stove. You have a cracked box that will smoke you out before it warms you. You need hay for that mule and food past November. You have 9 pounds of flour and an animal that cannot pull. Darius stopped stacking. He stood up straight. His back ached from bending, and his hands were raw from the bark, and every number Merritt listed was a number he had already counted and could not argue with. "A bank hole is where a man starts," Merritt said. He was not being cruel. His voice carried the weight of someone who had buried neighbors after storms exactly like the one that was coming. It is not where he lives through January. He mounted the dun mare, touched his hat toward his Clary, and rode up the draw trail without offering help. He did not offer help because he believed help would only delay the inevitable. In his experience, a man this poor this late in the season either found kin who would take him in or he froze. There was no third option. Darius watched him go. The wind picked up from the north, cutting across the flat above the draw, bending the grass horizontal. Down where Darius stood, 30 feet below the rim, the wind hit his face. But it was weaker here. Not gone, but weaker. He noticed that. He noticed the way the draw walls broke the gust, the way the air near the bottom moved differently than the air above. He filed it away. He did not yet know what to do with it. That night he set the cracked stove on the flat ground at the base of the draw, fed it cottonwood, and sat with Clary in the open air while the fire ate through the soft wood in less than 2 hours. The heat rose and the wind took it. Clary shivered inside 2 blankets, coughing every time the air shifted. Darius added the last of the cut wood. By midnight the stove was cold. By dawn the frost lay thick on the blankets, on the wagon seat, on the mule's back where it stood tied to a cottonwood stump with its head turned from the wind. 6 cords minimum, Merritt had said, under cover. Darius had 3/4 cord of rot wood and no cover at all. He needed a roof, a fixed stove, a fuel supply that could last 4 months, a way to keep his daughter's lungs clear, and he needed all of it in 10 weeks with no money, no lumber, no help, and no second chance. The draw sat below him, 30 feet of raw earth and silence. A grave, Judson Rye had called it. Merritt Gann had called it a place to start, not a place to live. Darius looked at the walls, sheer in places, sloped in others, the clay banded in layers of tan and rust where water had cut through over decades. He looked at the narrow pinch point where the banks came close together, maybe 16 feet apart, the gap small enough that a beam could span it without sagging. He looked at the bench, a flat shelf of packed earth 6 feet above the lowest channel, where flood water might run but a floor could sit dry. He did not yet have the idea, but the draw was talking to him in a language he almost understood. The moment came on the 4th day, and it came because of wind. A north gust hit the plains hard enough to strip loose soil off the furrows of a claim half a mile west. Darius was climbing down into the draw to retrieve an axe head that had slipped off the handle and fallen into the cut. Above him, the grass flattened. Grit peppered the rim. He could hear the wind tearing across the open ground like fabric ripping, but at the bottom of the draw, the air barely moved. He stopped. He held his hand out flat. Nothing. The wind roared above and stirred nothing below. He dug a match from his coat pocket and struck it against a stone. The flame stood straight. He raised his arm slowly, shoulder height, head height, and the flame leaned, then bent, then guttered out as it crossed the lip of the draw wall. Below the rim, the air was still. Then Clary coughed. She was sitting on the wagon seat above, wrapped in a blanket, and the sound came down to him broken by the wind but unmistakable, that deep, wet pull that tightened his stomach every time he heard it. Cold air in her chest, wind across her body, the same wind that could not reach where he stood. And he remembered his mother's root cellar in Ohio. He was 9 years old, and she was pressing potatoes into the earthen wall shelves of a cellar dug into the hillside behind their house. The air smelled of damp limestone and turned soil. A lantern hung from a nail, its smoke rising straight in the still air. His mother took his hand and pressed it flat against the wall. The stone was cool, but not cold. She said, "Cold moves fastest where wind can touch it. Take the wind away and the cold has to crawl." She was talking about potatoes, about keeping them from freezing in storage. But she was also talking about a law of heat that Darius did not have a name for, that moving air stripped warmth from surfaces far faster than still air, that a room protected from wind needed less fire to stay warm, that the earth itself held a temperature above freezing even when the surface froze. Darius stood at the bottom of the draw with the match still in his hand and thought about what he was standing inside. 3 walls of earth, a floor of packed clay, a gap overhead narrow enough to bridge. If he could close that gap, roof it flush with the prairie so the wind passed over instead of through, he would have a room where heat stayed, where a fire did not fight the wind for every degree, where a stove the size of his worked twice as hard because the air around it held still. He would not build a cabin beside the draw. He would build inside the draw. The design came in pieces over the next hour, while Clary dozed in the wagon and the wind screamed overhead. Darius walked the draw slowly, studying the banks. He found the pinch point, 16 feet across at the bench level, where the banks came close and the walls stood nearly vertical. The bench sat 6 feet above the lowest channel, above the line where flood debris had stacked in previous springs. He paced the bench. 24 feet of flat, stable ground before the draw widened again. A chamber 16 feet wide by 24 feet long. Earth walls on 3 sides. A roof of beams spanning the gap, covered with poles, brush, hay, sod. and 18 inches of packed clay and dirt, heavy enough to hold, flush enough that wind would pass over it like it passed over the prairie itself. No ridge line for the wind to catch, no wall face for the wind to press. The draw would swallow the house, and the house would disappear. He needed beams, heavy ones, oak, not cottonwood, something that could span 16 feet without sagging under the weight of 2 feet of earth. Where would he find oak beams on a treeless prairie? Salvage. The railroad had replaced a trestle bridge on the Republican River line the previous spring. Darius had worked on trestle crews. He knew what happened to pulled timbers. They got stacked in yards, sold for scrap, or left beside the grade for anyone willing to haul them. 8 beams would bridge the gap. He needed 8. But the living chamber was only half the problem. Fuel. Merritt said 6 cords minimum. Cottonwood burned too fast. He needed 20 cords to make cottonwood last through a full winter, maybe 21 if the cold ran long. That was 2,560 cubic feet of stacked wood, an impossible number for one man and a lame mule in 10 weeks, unless the fuel was stored where the weather could not reach it, inside the draw, under cover, in a vault cut into the bank beside the living chamber. 42 feet long, 8 feet high, 8 feet deep. Bays marked by cord count so he could ration through the worst months, protected from snow, from ice crust, from wind that would seal an outdoor pile into a frozen block. The risks stacked as fast as the solutions. If he misjudged the bench height, spring flood would drown the chamber. If he misjudged the roof weight, frozen earth would collapse inward and bury them. If he misjudged the ventilation, the stove draft, the smoke path, the air exchange, carbon monoxide or backdraft smoke would kill them faster than cold. He needed a drainage gutter below the floor, a sloped spill channel around the entrance, a dogleg entry so wind could not blow straight inside, and a stove pipe hidden low enough that wind could not catch it. He could fail at any of these. He could fail at all of them, but the alternative was Clary coughing through 10 weeks of open-air cold with 3/4 cord of rotwood and a cracked stove. The alternative was Merritt Gann being right. That afternoon, Lenora Pike appeared at the rim of the draw. She was a lean woman with sunburned hands and a direct way of speaking that came from running a claim alone with 2 boys and no margin for politeness. She had watched Darius from her claim for 3 days, watched him stack wood, watched him climb in and out of the draw, watched him hold a lit candle at different heights along the walls and mark the spots where the flame stood still. "I saw you testing draft with a taper," she said from above. She did not come down. "My husband did that in our cellar before the roof fell on the jars. Are you planning to freeze down there, drown, or smoke yourself first?" Darius looked up at her. "Depends on the order." Lenora did not smile. "I have seen cellars sweat until the bedding rots. I have seen sod roofs sag in a warm spell and cave in a cold one. I have seen children sicken from damp air in a bank dugout so bad their mother moved them into a tent in February. And she lost the younger one anyway." She paused. "You have a child in that wagon with a chest cough. What are you building?" "A room the wind cannot find," Darius said. "The wind finds everything out here." "Not 30 feet down." Lenora looked at the draw walls, at the bench, at the narrow gap above. She was not stupid. She could see what he was planning. She could also see every way it could fail. "You roof that span and get the pitch wrong, water pools in the middle and comes through in the first melt. You cut into that bank for a fuel store and the clay shears loose after a freeze-thaw cycle. You seal that space too tight and your stove eats the air faster than you can breathe it." "I know," Darius said. "You know." She said it the same flat way Merritt had. Knowing and building are not the same weather. She pulled her coat tighter and walked back toward her claim without offering help, without wishing him luck, and without telling him to stop. Her silence on the last count was the closest thing to encouragement he had received since Etta died. Darius could not answer every concern. Not yet. He did not know if the roof would hold. He did not know if the bank would shear. He did not know if the stove draft would clear or choke. He knew one thing: the draw killed the wind, and without wind the cold moved slow. Everything else was a problem to solve before the first deep freeze. He had 10 weeks. He started walking toward the railroad salvage yard. The line about the draw spread through Benkelman Crossing before Darius had been on his land a week. Judson Rye made sure of it. Kells bought a flood and called it a house. Judson set it first at the supply counter in Parcher's store, paying for a sack of oats he did not need, timing the line for when 3 Crooked L hands and the storekeeper's wife could hear it. The hands laughed. The wife repeated it to a neighbor that afternoon. By the end of the week, children at the crossing dared each other to ride out to the draw and throw stones down into it. A ranch hand named Foy Beecham told Merritt Gann he had seen Darius dragging a stove into a ditch, and Merritt shook his head and said nothing, which was worse than anything he could have said. The mockery was reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Dugouts were known across the plains as poor man shelters: damp, dark, temporary, and shameful. A family living in a dugout was a family that had failed to build a house. The social ladder ran from sod house to frame house to painted frame house, and anyone still underground after the first year was someone the community regarded with pity or contempt. Darius was not just building underground. He was building inside a dry wash that could fill with water in a hard rain. The mockery wrote itself. Judson had a second reason to watch. If Darius abandoned the parcel, any improvements, beams, stove, cut wood, the cleared bench inside the draw reverted to the land. Judson held an option on 2 adjacent sections for the Crooked L, and the draw crossing was the only protected cattle path to the ranch's winter pasture. A roofed draw with stored fuel was worth 20 times what Judson had sold it for. He just needed Darius to quit. So Judson came to watch. He brought Merritt and 2 Crooked L hands on a Tuesday afternoon when Darius was lowering a beam into the draw. The beam was a rejected railroad bridge timber, white oak, 14 feet long, scarred from the pile driver but sound at the core. Darius had hauled it 19 miles from the salvage yard using the lame mule and a borrowed plank sled, a trip that took 2 days and left the mule worse than before. He had 3 beams down. He needed 5 more. Judson leaned on the draw rim and watched Darius wrestle the timber into position. "That is a fine roof for a coffin," Judson said. Darius did not look up. "Only if I put it where water wants to go." "Water wants every low place," Merritt said. He tapped the draw bank with his walking cane. "Sooner or later." "That is why the bench sits 6 feet above the channel," Darius said. He pointed at the flat shelf where the chamber would go. "Floodline is here." He pointed lower at the debris stacked against the opposite wall. "Living floor is here." He pointed at the bench. 3 feet of margin." Merritt looked. He could see the logic. He could also see the 50 things that could defeat it. 3 feet is not much when a spring storm puts the Republican over its banks, and every draw west of the county line runs brown. "I'm not building in the channel," Darius said. "I'm building above it." "You are building in a hole," Judson said. "A hole with a river's address." The 2 ranch hands laughed. Darius set the beam into the notch he had cut in the bank wall, and checked it with the level he had made from a glass bottle half filled with water. The beam sat true. He did not answer Judson. He did not need to. The beam was in place, and Judson could see it was in place, and that bothered Judson more than any argument would have. But Darius had not yet solved the entrance. The dogleg design was still marks scratched in clay. The drainage channel was still an idea. Merritt saw the gap in the plan because Merritt knew what questions to ask, and Darius could feel the older man's doubt settling into the silence like cold air into a room. After they left, Clary came to the edge of the draw and looked down. "Do underground people count as neighbors?" she asked. Darius did not have an answer for that. No one offered help. The storekeeper at Parcher's refused credit when Darius asked for nails. A rancher's wife pulled her children away when Clary tried to play near the crossing church. Lenora Pike, who had at least come to look, told her two boys, Orvie, 12, and Pas, 14, to stay clear of the draw. Darius was alone with a project that needed 4 men and 10 weeks, and he had 1 man and a number that dropped every day. The mule's shoulder worsened. Darius wrapped it with a flour sack soaked in cold water, but the animal could not pull weight without limping, which meant every beam, every load of brush, every cord of wood had to be dragged shorter distances with longer rest. He began cutting cottonwood at night by moonlight, working until his hands blistered and the blisters broke and the raw skin stuck to the saw handle. He lost 2 fingernails prying bark. He ate half rations to stretch the flour. Clary ate full rations because Clary had to eat, and the gap between what Darius consumed and what his body spent on labor widened every day. 3 beams in place, 5 still needed. Less than 1 cord of cottonwood stacked. 20 more to go. 9 weeks until deep winter. The numbers were impossible. Merritt Gann's verdict hung in the air like frost. A bank hole is where a man starts. Not where he lives through January, but Darius had stood at the bottom of the draw with a lit match and watched the flames stand straight while the wind tore the world apart above him. He had pressed his hand to the clay wall and felt it cool, not cold, the earth holding its own temperature like his mother's root cellar in Ohio, steady and patient and indifferent to the weather overhead. He did not know yet if the roof would hold. He did not know if the fuel math would work. He did not know if the stove would draft clean or choke them with smoke. He did not know if Clary's cough would survive another week of open air, let alone a full winter underground. What he knew was that the wind killed heat and the earth held it, and every house on the prairie fought the wind while the draw swallowed it. The men with money built walls to stop the gale. Darius had no money. He had a hole in the ground that did the same work for free. He picked up the saw. The 4th beam was waiting at the salvage yard, 19 miles away. The mule could not make the trip again. Darius would have to drag it himself. If you have ever had someone look at your work, your plan, your effort, and tell you it was not enough, tell us in the comments. Because Darius Kells was not finished, and neither was the winter. The first 3 beams had taken 6 days. The 4th took 4 days alone, because Darius walked to the salvage yard, paid the yardman 2 pounds of flour for a scarred white oak stringer the railroad had condemned for a split end, and dragged it home on a plank sled with a rope harness cut from the mule's spare lead. 19 miles. He wrapped his wrist in strips of flour sacking to keep the rope from cutting through the skin. By the 2nd day of dragging, the sacking was brown with dried blood, and the skin beneath it was raw in 2 places. He ate nothing on the return trip. He had calculated the flour. 9 pounds divided by 2 mouths, at quarter-pound rations per day, gave them 18 days. Clary ate a full share. Darius ate half. That stretched it to 24 days. Maybe 26 if he thinned the porridge with water until it was more broth than meal. After that, he would need to trade labor for food, and no one in the county was offering work to the man who lived in a ditch. The fourth beam dropped into its notch on October 9th. Darius checked the level, the glass bottle with water, the only precision tool he had, and the beam sat true. 4 down, 4 to go. The salvage yard was 19 miles each way. His boots had worn through at the left heel. The nights were colder now, the frost arriving before sunset, the grass crunching underfoot by morning. He cut cottonwood while the light held and hauled it into the draw by hand. Each round weighed 30 to 50 pounds. He stacked them against the bank wall where the fuel vault would go, counting as he stacked. 128 cubic feet to a cord. A stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, 8 feet long. He had built one stack and started a second. 1 1/4 cords. 19 3/4 still to go. The cottonwood was soft and punky, the kind that threw heat for an hour and left nothing but ash. He needed 21 cords of it to match what 6 cords of oak would do, and even that number assumed a tight room with no wind-stealing heat through gaps. If the roof failed or the doors did not seal, 21 cords would burn through by February and leave March empty. Every number pointed at the same conclusion. Not enough time, not enough wood, not enough hands. Clary counted rounds from the wagon seat, scratching marks into a notched stick the way Darius had taught her, keeping track of a number that was not growing fast enough. She had learned the math without being told. She knew each mark was a round, and 4 marks made a row, and she could see that the rows were not filling as fast as the frost was coming. She did not say this. She just kept scratching. The 5th beam came from a different source. Darius found it half buried in flood debris at the bottom of the draw. A cottonwood trunk, not oak, too soft for primary roof support, but sound enough for a crossbeam if he doubled it with a second trunk lashed alongside. He spent a day digging it free, splitting it flat on one side with the draw knife, and wrestling it up to the bench. His shoulders seized that night. He could not lift his arms above his head for 2 days afterward, and the pain ran from his neck to his wrists like hot wire pulled through the muscle. Clary brought him water from the seep at the draw bottom, climbing down and up the bank on a path Darius had cut into the clay, and the sight of her carrying a tin cup with both hands while her cough echoed off the draw walls was the closest he came to quitting. He did not quit. He picked up the draw knife and went back to the 5th beam. On October 14th, the first hard frost hit. Not a dusting, a killing frost, the kind that blackened the remaining garden patches across the county and sent the crooked L hands scrambling to move cattle closer to the creek shelter. Darius woke with ice on the blankets. Clary's breathing was audible from 3 feet away, a thin whistle on the exhale that meant the cold had reached deep into her chest. He lit the stove at dawn and fed it cottonwood, and the fire burned hot for 40 minutes, and then the wood was gone, and the stove cooled, and the air in the open draw went from tolerable to sharp in less than an hour. 40 minutes of heat. That was what his fuel supply bought him. 40 minutes against a winter that would last 4 months. He needed the roof closed. He needed the walls sealed. He needed wood stacked in bays where the weather could not reach it. And he needed all of it before the next frost, and the one after that, and the long stretch of deep cold that was building somewhere north of here and moving south across the plains like something with weight and patience. A bank slump buried his cross-cut saw on October 16th. The clay wall above the fuel vault site sheared loose after a night of light rain, sending 200 pounds of wet earth down onto his tool pile. He dug the saw out with his hands, clay packing under his broken fingernails, the pain sharp enough to make his eyes water. The blade was bent. He spent half a day straightening it with the hammer and a flat stone, working by feel because he had no anvil, and when he tested it on a cottonwood round, the cut wandered left. A crooked cut meant wasted wood, wasted time, wasted motion. He could still use the saw. Barely. That same week, Judson Rye rode to Benkelman Crossing and bought the only pile of scrap lumber within 10 miles. Fence rails, broken crate boards, old barn siding, paying the owner $6. The lumber was worth maybe $2. Judson did not need it. He stacked it behind the Crooked L bunkhouse and left it there. He was removing options. Every board Darius could not buy was another day added to a timeline that had no room for delays. Darius learned about the purchase from a freight driver who stopped at the draw to water his team. The driver said Judson had told the storekeeper he was buying the lumber for fence repair, but the boards were still sitting in a pile behind the bunkhouse, untouched, going gray in the weather. The driver looked at the draw, at the beams spanning the gap, at the cottonwood stacked along the wall, and said, "You're the one building in the ditch." He said it without malice, the way a man describes something he does not understand. Then he watered his team and left. 5 beams in place, 3 still needed, 1.5 cords stacked. 19.5 to go. 8 weeks until January. A saw that cut crooked. A mule that could not pull. A daughter whose breathing sounded worse every morning, and a community that had decided the draw was a grave, not a house, and that the man inside it was too stubborn to know the difference. The temperature dropped 4 degrees that night. Frost came an hour earlier than the night before. Somewhere north, beyond the flat horizon, the first real cold was building, the kind that locked rivers and killed cattle standing upright and turned a cracked stove in an open draw into a joke that no one would laugh at because the people inside it would be dead. Darius wrapped his bleeding wrists in fresh flour sacking, checked the bent saw blade, and walked to the draw rim. Below him, the chamber was a skeleton, 5 beams spanning the gap, raw earth walls, a flat bench waiting for a floor that did not exist. The fuel vault was a mark scratched in clay. The entrance was an idea. The roof was open sky. But the air at the bottom of the draw was still. He could feel it from here, the way the wind split around the cut in the earth and left the space below untouched. The prairie screamed with wind, and the draw held its breath. He climbed down. The 6th beam would not haul itself, and the cold was not going to wait for him to finish. Orrin Traft found Darius on October 21st, and the finding was not an accident. Orrin was 62 years old, a former bridge carpenter who had spent 11 years setting timber for the Army on the Platte River crossings and another 9 building railroad trestles before his back gave out and his wife died, and he drifted into odd work across the western counties. He lived in a half dugout on leased land 3 miles south, alone, with a shelf of carpentry tools he kept sharper than most men kept their razors. He had heard about the man in the draw the way everyone heard about the man in the draw. Through Judson Rye's joke, repeated until it became the county's favorite way to say a man was finished. But Orrin had not come to laugh. He had come because a freight driver told him the man in the draw was notching beams with layout lines. Darius was working on the 6th beam when Orrin appeared at the rim. The beam was a salvaged railroad stringer, white oak, 13.5 feet long, shorter than the others, which meant Darius had to extend the bank notch deeper to seat it at the right span. He was on his knees with the draw knife, shaving the notch wall to a flat bearing surface, and he had marked the load path first, a chalk line showing where the beam's weight would transfer into the bank, angled to follow the grain of the compacted clay rather than cut across it. Orrin stood at the rim for a long time, watching. Then he said, "You marked the load before you marked the cut." Darius looked up. He did not know the man. "That means somebody taught you not to die under your own work," Orrin said. He came down the bank path slowly, favoring his left knee, and crouched beside the notch. He ran his thumb along the chalk line. Trestle work? Republican River Bridge crew, Darius said. 2 seasons. Who was your foreman? A man named Creel, out of Omaha. Orrin nodded. Creel set beams plumb. Most crew bosses eyeball it and hope. Creel used a level. He looked at the glass bottle sitting on the beam. You are using a bottle. I do not have a level. Orrin reached into his coat and pulled out a brass spirit level, 9 inches long, scratched and dented, but with a bubble that floated true. He set it on the beam. The bubble centered. Neither do I anymore, he said, and left the level on the wood. Darius stared at it. He did not reach for it. In his experience, gifts from strangers were either charity or debt, and he could not afford either one. Orrin read the hesitation. I am not giving it to you because you need it. I am giving it to you because you know what it does. There is a difference. He stood up, his knee popping, and looked at the draw walls, the 5 beams in place, the cottonwood stacked against the bank. You are building a chamber. Yes. How deep is the bench above the flood channel? 6 feet. Show me the flood line. Darius pointed at the debris against the opposite wall. Cottonwood branches, a rusted bucket, a tangle of wire pushed up against the bank by the last spring's high water. The line sat 3 feet below the bench. Orrin studied it. He walked the bench, pressing his boot into the clay at intervals, feeling for softness. He looked at the bank above the fuel vault site, where the slump had already taken 200 pounds of earth. He tapped the exposed face with his knuckle, listening. Your bank is not cribbed, he said. I know. I have not had time. You do not have time to dig yourself out after a collapse either. Orrin pulled the draw knife from Darius's hand, not roughly, but with the certainty of a man who had done this work for decades. Before you hollow the fuel vault, you brace the cut face, staggered cottonwood posts 2 feet apart, driven into the floor and wedged against a cap beam at the top. The posts do not hold the bank up. The bank holds itself up. The posts keep the face from shearing loose in a freeze-thaw cycle. You lost earth here already. He pointed at the slump scar. You will lose more if you do not crib before you cut. That is 2 days of work I do not have. It is 2 days that keep you from spending a week digging out your saw again, or your daughter. The mention of Clary was not a threat. It was a fact delivered without sentiment, and it landed harder than any sentiment could have. Darius looked at the slump scar, at the raw clay face, at the fuel vault outline scratched into the bank. Orrin was right. He had been building forward without bracing behind, and the bank had already told him once that it would not tolerate the neglect. I will cut the posts, Darius said. I will cut the posts, Orrin said. You set the 6th beam. We do both at the same time, and you lose 1 day instead of 2. That was how it started. Not charity. Not pity. Recognition. One man who knew timberwork seeing another man who knew timberwork and responding to the competence rather than the poverty. Orrin did not move in. He did not promise to stay. He came each morning at first light, worked until his back seized in the early afternoon, and walked the 3 miles home before dark. He brought his own food, hard bread, dried beef, a tin of lard that he shared without being asked. He did not talk about Darius's situation. He talked about wood. The first lesson was cribbing. Orrin cut 12 cottonwood posts from deadfall along the creek bottom, each one 8 feet long and thick enough to stand without splitting. He drove them into the bench floor with a wooden mallet Darius had never seen, a shipwright's tool, Orrin said, from a life before Kansas. The posts went in 2 feet apart along the fuel vault face, angled slightly inward so the bank's own weight pressed them tighter. A cap beam ran across the top, wedged into notches cut with a precision that made Darius's rough work look like guessing. When the cribbing was done, the bank face was braced against 40 feet of potential shear, and the fuel vault could be hollowed without risking collapse. The second lesson was water. Orrin walked the draw from end to end, studying the channel, the banks, the debris lines. He came back and said, "You cannot block a draw. You can only redirect it. Give the water a cleaner path than your doorway, and it will take the cleaner path every time." He showed Darius how to cut a bypass channel, a shallow trench running along the opposite bank, lower than the living bench, that would carry flood flow past the chamber entrance without pooling. He showed him how to slope the entrance approach so water ran away from the door rather than toward it. He showed him how to line the sump pit with flat stones set at an angle, so water that seeped through the floor drained to one point and could be baled rather than spreading under the bed. The third lesson was draft. Orrin crouched beside the cracked stove and studied it the way a doctor studies a wound. "A stove needs 3 things in a sealed room," he said: intake low, exhaust high, and a smoke shelf between the firebox and the flue so downdraft does not push smoke back into the room. He pointed at the crack in the firebox. "That crack is your intake. You do not fix it, you control it. Open the crack toward the door side, where the air comes in cold and low. The fire pulls the cold air across the firebox, heats it, and sends it up the flue. If you seal the crack, you lose your intake and the stove suffocates." Darius had been planning to patch the crack with clay. Orrin had just told him the crack was the design. The fourth lesson was the roof. Orrin showed Darius how to pack clay over brush in thin, wet layers, each one no thicker than a man's finger, letting each layer dry before adding the next. If you put it on thick, it cracks when it dries and leaks when it rains. If you put it on thin, it dries as one skin. You're not building a wall. You're growing a hide. This took time Darius did not have. But Orrin said, "A leaking roof in December kills you faster than no roof in October. Do it slow now, or do it over in a blizzard." The construction sequence consumed 4 weeks. Darius and Orrin set the final 3 beams, 8 salvaged oak stringers spanning the narrow draw, seated in notched banks, and checked with the brass level. They laid smaller poles crosswise over the beams, tight enough that a fist could not fit between them. Over the poles, they spread willow brush from the creek bottom, 3 inches thick. Over the brush, they laid prairie hay, dry and dense. Over the hay, they placed sod squares cut from the flat land above, root side down so the grass would knit. Over the sod, they packed 18 inches of clay and earth, applied in thin layers, each one dried before the next, the way Orrin had taught. The roof grew like something alive. Each morning, Darius checked the previous day's layer for cracks, patched them with wet clay, and added the next coat. Orrin pressed his palm against the surface at intervals, testing for give. When a section felt soft, they waited. When it held firm, they advanced. The process was slower than Darius wanted and faster than Orrin expected, and the tension between those 2 speeds became the rhythm of their work. Darius cut the entrance into a dogleg, a right-angle turn that forced anyone entering to pass through a short corridor before reaching the living chamber. The corridor killed straight wind. He hung 2 doors, mismatched in size, and salvaged from different sources. One from a collapsed homestead 6 miles east, the other built from the wagon's tailgate. Between the doors sat a dead-air space 4 feet deep that acted as a buffer between the outside temperature and the living chamber. He dug the sump pit and lined it with flat creek stones. He built a raised plank bed for Clary, 18 inches off the floor, above the damp line that Orrin predicted would appear after the first hard freeze. He set the stove into an alcove cut into the bank wall, the cracked firebox facing the door side, the flue running up through a clay-lined channel to a stovepipe that emerged through the sod roof and hid inside a patch of wild plum brush. From 20 feet away, the pipe was invisible. From 100 feet, the entire draw house was invisible, a flat patch of prairie with grass growing on it, betrayed only by a thin column of smoke that dissipated before it rose above the brush. The fuel vault ran 42 feet along the bank, 8 feet high, 8 feet deep, braced with orange cribbing posts. Darius marked the bays with notches cut into the posts, each bay 1 cord, 128 cubic feet. He filled them with everything he could cut, drag, and stack. Cottonwood rounds, dead elm from a creek bottom blowdown, broken fence rails, brush bundles for kindling. Clary kept count on her notched sticks. 3 cords, 7 cords, 11 cords, each number a small war against the winter that was tightening around them. The progress markers became the heartbeat of the story. 14 cords stacked, 7 to go. Roof 3/4 covered, entrance sealed, stovepipe drawing clean, sump dry. Mules sheltered in a lean-to at the draw rim, wrapped in the 3rd blanket that Darius had given up sleeping under. Oren's back gave out twice. The second time, he lay on the bench floor for an hour, unable to move, while Darius packed clay alone in silence. When Oren stood up, he said, "Do not tell me to rest. Rest is what I will do when I am dead." Darius lost more weight. His belt cinched 2 notches tighter than it had in September. His hands were a map of cuts, blisters, broken nails, and calluses so thick the skin cracked in the dry air and bled along the creases. He worked by moonlight on clear nights, cutting cottonwood rounds until the saw blade heated from friction, and the cut wandered so far he had to start over. Clary slept in the half-finished chamber on the raised bed, wrapped in both remaining blankets, her cough muffled by the earth walls that already held the air warmer than the open draw above. Merritt Gann came back on November 12th. He rode to the draw rim, looked down, and could not find the house. The roof was flush with the prairie. The entrance was hidden behind a clay-packed berm. Only the thin wisp of smoke from the plum brush gave it away. Merritt dismounted and came down the bank path. Darius led him inside. The foreman stood in the living chamber, 16 feet by 24 feet, lit by 2 candles, the stove pushing warmth into still air, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "A calm, cold night proves nothing." "I know," Darius said. "January is not November. The wind that comes in January does not knock. It arrives and it stays for a week, and it does not care what you have built." "I know." Merritt looked at the fuel bays. He counted the notches. 14 cords, cottonwood. Mostly some elm. You need 21 of cottonwood to last through April. You're 7 short. 6 3/4. Merritt almost smiled. Almost. "You're counting in fractions. That is either a good sign or a sign that you have gone mad." He put his hat back on. "I still say a bank hole is not a house. But I will say this, it is not a grave either. Not yet." He left. It was the closest thing to approval Darius had received from the man who had sentenced him to death in September. That same week, Lenora Pike sent her 2 sons with 2 wagon loads of broken fence rails. The boys, Orvie and Pace, pulled up at the draw rim without explanation, unloaded the rails, and left. No note, no visit. No conversation. Lenora had seen Clary sleeping in the cold 2 weeks earlier, before the roof was closed, and the image had worked on her in the way that images of children in danger work on anyone who has children of their own. She still doubted the plan. She no longer doubted the effort. The fence rails added 1.5 cords to the fuel vault. 15 and a half total, 5.5 still needed. Darius cut wood every day until the saw blade went dull, and the cottonwood was gone from every deadfall within walking distance. He switched to elm from the creek bottom, harder to cut, but denser, worth more heat per cord. By late November, the count stood at 18 cords, 3 short of the target. Close enough to survive a normal winter, not close enough to survive the one that was coming. By late December, the draw house was complete. Snow skimmed over the roof without catching. Grass stubble poked through the sod layer, and in another season the entire surface would green over and vanish into the prairie entirely. The entrance was invisible from 50 feet. A clay-packed berm with a low door set into what looked like a natural bank fold. The stovepipe hid in the plum brush, its smoke thinning in the wind before it cleared the branches. Inside, the air held steady. Darius kept a thermometer he had salvaged from a broken railroad office, a mercury tube in a tin housing, cracked at the top but still readable. With the doors closed and the stove cold, the thermometer read 48 degrees. Outside, the wind cut exposed skin, and the ground froze hard enough to ring under a boot heel. 48 degrees underground without a fire. With one small fire, half a cottonwood round split fine, the living chamber climbed to 58 degrees and held there for hours after the flame dropped to coals. The stove crack worked as Orrin had predicted, pulling cold air low across the firebox and sending it up the flue warm. Smoke drew cleanly when the lower intake, the dogleg entry, cracked open 2 fingers wide, fed fresh air into the corridor. The sump caught meltwater, but did not overflow. The fuel bays stayed dry. Darius allowed himself one night of something close to hope. But hope is not safety, and the prairie was changing. Cattle began drifting south ahead of the wind, their backs crusted with frost, moving in the slow, stupid way that animals move when instinct tells them something is coming and they have no plan for it. Birds vanished from the fence lines. The sky turned the color of dirty tin, a flat gray that pressed down on the horizon and did not break for days. Then a warm, wet thaw came through, 2 days of temperatures above freezing that melted the top layer of snow into slush, which then froze overnight into a hard crust that sealed the old snow underneath. A man could walk on the crust. A horse broke through it. And every outdoor woodpile in the county was now locked under a shell of ice that would take an axe to crack. Lenora Pike came to the draw entrance and stood outside without entering. "It feels warmer in there than I expected," she said. "But what happens when the snow buries the entrance and you cannot clear it?" "I built a second vent shaft," Darius said, "behind the fuel vault. Air comes in even if the door is blocked." Lenora looked at the sky. "What happens when you cannot get out at all?" Darius did not answer that. He did not have an answer. If the entrance buried deep enough and the vent shaft packed with drift snow, they would have air for a time. The chamber was large enough, the sod roof porous enough to exchange slowly, but they would be trapped, underground, with a sick child, and no way to reach help. Judson Rye rode past the draw on Christmas Eve. He stopped his horse at the rim and looked down. He could not see the house. He sat there for a long time, then said to no one, "Hidden fuel is still fuel I can lean for unpaid debt." He said it loud enough for Darius to hear through the vent shaft. Then he rode on. The blue-black front appeared on the northern horizon 2 days later. Orrin Traft came to the draw house on December 28th. He made Darius rehearse the emergency sequence, bank the fire to coals, close the outer door and wedge it, clear the vent cap of ice or debris, check the sump for rising water, count Clary's breathing. 12 breaths a minute was normal, above 20 meant fever, below 8 meant cold. Ration wood by bay, 1 bay every 3 days at crisis heat, half a bay every 3 days at maintenance. Do not open the door for any reason during peak wind unless someone is dying on the other side. Darius repeated it back. Oren corrected him twice. Once on the vent cap order, once on the wood rationing. At crisis heat, you are burning a third of a cord every 3 days. That is your 18 cords gone by late February. At maintenance heat, you stretch it to March. You choose maintenance unless the child's fever goes above 103. How do I know her fever without a medical thermometer? You know, you are her father. If her skin burns your lips when you press them to her forehead, that is above 103. Oren looked at the sky. The blue-black line was closer now, a wall of weather stretching from one edge of the horizon to the other. I need to warn the Porters, he said. The Porters were a family 3 miles east, new to the county, living in a frame shack with a sod addition and an outdoor woodpile. Their roof is not tied down. They will lose it. Stay here, Darius said. The Porters have 4 children under 10. Darius could not argue with that. Oren put on his coat, checked his gloves, and climbed the bank path. At the rim, he turned back and looked at the draw house one more time. The invisible roof, the hidden entrance, the thin smoke from the plum brush. He said, keep the intake cracked, even when it feels cold, especially when it feels cold. Then he walked into the wind. The storm arrived on New Year's week, and it did not arrive gently. The first sign was the sound, not wind, the absence of everything else. The birds had been gone for days, but now the small sounds disappeared too, the creak of the lean-to, the mules breathing, the distant bark of a ranch dog. The air went dead, heavy, pressed flat. Then the wind hit. It came from the north-northwest, and it did not gust. It arrived at full force and stayed, a constant pressure that flattened the grass, stripped the snow crust into flying shards, and turned the air white. Visibility dropped to nothing in minutes. A man standing in the open would lose sight of his own feet. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the first hour and kept dropping. By nightfall, it was 20 below. By midnight, the thermometer on the Crooked L bunkhouse, the one mounted on the exterior wall, read 28 below, and the mercury had stopped moving, frozen in the tube. Darius heard the wind arrive from inside the draw house. He heard it the way a man underwater hears a boat engine. Distant, enormous, muffled by the mass of earth between him and the surface. The candle flame on the shelf did not move. The stove fire drew clean and steady. The thermometer on the wall read 52 degrees. He closed the outer door and wedged it with an oak brace. He cracked the inner door 2 fingers wide for intake. He checked the vent cap, clear. He checked the sump, dry. He counted Clary's breathing. 14 breaths a minute. A little fast, but she was awake, sitting on the raised bed with a blanket around her shoulders, watching him. Is it the storm? She asked. Yes. The bad one? I think so. She pulled the blanket tighter. The house is warm. It was. The stove held a small fire, split elm, denser than cottonwood, burning slow and clean. The chamber sat at 58 degrees and rising. The earth walls radiated stored warmth from the ground itself, a deep, constant heat that did not flicker or gust. The air smelled of clay, of wood smoke, of the dried grass in the sod roof. It smelled like the inside of the earth. Above them, the wind tore across the prairie with a sound that ranchers later described as strong enough to rip harness rings from leather. It found every wall, every roof edge, every gap in every structure it crossed. It lifted shingles. It peeled sod. It drove snow sideways through cracks a knife blade could not fit through, packing the interiors of buildings with fine white powder that melted on contact with warm air and soaked everything it touched. But the draw house had no walls for the wind to find. The roof was flush with the prairie, no edge to catch, no ridge to lift. The entrance was below grade and dogleg, so the wind could not blow straight through. The stove pipe was hidden in plum brush and shorter than the surrounding scrub, invisible to the force passing overhead. The wind crossed the draw house the way it crossed a flat field, without knowing anything was there. The first 12 hours passed in near silence underground. Darius fed the stove at intervals, burning 1/4 of a bay of elm and cottonwood mixed. The thermometer climbed to 62, then 65 when the coals settled into a steady glow. He melted snow for drinking water using a tin pot on the stovetop. He made porridge for Clary and ate a half portion himself. He checked the sump twice. Dry. Then Clary's breathing changed. It started as a whistle on the exhale, the same sound she made in cold air, the sound that tightened his chest every time he heard it. But the air was not cold. The air was 65 degrees, warmer than most houses in the county. The whistle deepened. Her forehead was hot when he pressed his lips to it. Not burning, hot. Fever. Darius pulled the blanket closer around her and cracked the stove door to push more heat into the room. He needed steam, warm, wet air to open her chest. He filled the tin pot with snow from a bucket he had packed inside before the storm hit and set it on the stove top. The water heated. Steam rose. Clary breathed it in, and the whistle eased, but her skin stayed hot, and her eyes went glassy, the way children's eyes go when fever takes hold. He could not leave. The entrance drift was chest high already, packed hard by wind. Even if he dug through, the surface was a whiteout. He could not find a doctor. He could not find anyone. He could manage the fever with steam, with water, with keeping the temperature steady, and he could wait. The second complication arrived 18 hours into the storm. Pounding. Not wind, fists. Against the outer door, muffled by the snowpack, but unmistakable. Someone was hitting the door. Darius put his hand on the oak brace and hesitated. Oren's instruction. Do not open the door for any reason during peak wind unless someone is dying on the other side. He pulled the brace. He shoved the outer door against the packed drift and forced a gap. Through the gap, he saw a glove, a child's glove, brown wool, reaching through the snow. He grabbed the glove and pulled. Nothing came. He dug into the drift with his hands, throwing snow behind him into the corridor, and found a body. Small. Curled on its side in the snow tunnel. Orvie Pike, 12 years old, Lenora's younger son, half frozen, his lips blue, and his coat packed with ice. If you are still with us, if you need to know what happens next, hit subscribe and stay, because the storm was not finished, and neither was the night. Darius dragged the boy through the corridor and into the living chamber. He stripped the frozen coat, wrapped Orvie in the third blanket, the one the mule had been using, and laid him beside the stove. The boy's skin was white where it should have been pink, and blue where it should have been white. His fingers were stiff. His breathing was shallow. Clary watched from the bed. Her fever made her quiet, not scared. She said, "Is he dead?" "No. He looks dead." "He is cold. People look dead when they are cold." Darius rubbed Orvie's hands between his own, working warmth into the fingers, feeling for the moment when circulation returned, and the skin flushed from white to red. It took 20 minutes. The boy cried when the feeling came back. That was a good sign. Feeling meant blood. Blood meant alive. When Orvie could speak, he said Lenora had sent him. Their sod lean-to roof had started lifting on the windward side, the poles pulling free from the wall tie. Lenore had sent Pace to the Crooked L for help and Orvie to the draw house because it was closer. Orvie had walked 2 miles in the whiteout, lost direction twice, fallen into the draw by accident, and followed the bank wall until he hit the entrance berm. By accident, he had found the invisible house by falling into the ditch. 3 miles east, the Crooked L ranch house was losing its war with the wind. The roof boards on the west side peeled back in the first 6 hours, exposing the interior to driving snow. The outdoor woodpile, 8 cords of good oak and elm, stacked in the yard the way every ranch stacked wood, was sealed under a crust of wind-driven ice and compressed snow. The hands tried to break through with axes and gave up after an hour. They burned chair legs, they burned feed boxes, they burned a broken wagon tongue. They fed the stove whatever would fit through the firebox door, and the stove fought the wind pouring through the broken roof, and the wind won. Merritt Gann tied a rope around his waist, knotted the other end to the bunkhouse door, and tried to cross the yard to the hay barn. He vanished into the white. The rope went taut. The men inside pulled him back. He tried again, vanished again. The third time he made the barn, but the hay was frozen to the ground and would not pull free. He crawled back on his hands and knees, the rope dragging behind him, snow packed into every fold of his clothing. Orrin Traft never reached the Porters. The storm caught him a mile east of the draw, and he turned for the nearest shelter he could find, the Crooked L bunkhouse. He arrived with frost on his eyebrows and his left glove frozen to his hand. He organized the men. They crawled cattle panel sections up onto the broken roof, lashing them down with rope, covering the gap with anything that would hold, tarps, horse blankets, a stretched cowhide. It was not a repair. It was a bandage. But it slowed the snow coming in, and that was enough to keep the stove from losing the room entirely. The frostbite took 2 of Orrin's fingers, the left hand, the last 2. He did not mention it until the next morning, when the skin turned black and the pain arrived. A ranch hand named Foy Beecham went out during a lull to reach the haystack. The lull lasted 4 minutes. Then the wind returned. They found Foy's lantern 3 days later, still standing upright in the snow, the oil burned out, the glass chimney frosted on the inside. They found Foy 60 yards past it, face down, one arm reaching toward the hay barn he had almost reached. Inside the draw house, none of this was visible. Darius heard nothing but the deep hum of wind passing overhead and the pop of elm coals in the stove. Clary's fever held through the second night, but did not climb. Orvie recovered enough to sit up and eat porridge. The thermometer read 63 degrees. The sump stayed dry. The fuel bays held their wood, dry and accessible, each cord clearly marked. Darius rationed by notch, 1 bay every 3 days at crisis heat. The elm burned slower than the cottonwood, stretching each bay further. He calculated. At this rate, 18 cords would carry them through February with a margin. If the storm broke within a week, and Kansas blizzards, for all their fury, rarely held full force for more than 5 or 6 days, he would emerge with fuel to spare. On the 4th day, pounding came at the door again. Darius opened it and found Merritt Gann, hat gone, scarf frozen to his face, half carrying Orrin Traft. Orrin's left hand was wrapped in a strip of horse blanket soaked red. His face was gray. Merritt's eyes were red-rimmed, and his breathing was ragged, and his coat was crusted with ice so thick it crackled when he moved. "The Crooked L roof is holding," Merritt said. "Barely. We have 9 men in the bunkhouse and nothing left to burn by tomorrow." Darius let them in. The chamber held 6 people now. Darius, Clary, Orvie, Orrin, Merritt, and a silence heavy with everything that had been said between these men in the weeks before. Orrin sat against the bank wall and looked at the room. He looked at the stove, drawing clean. He looked at the walls, dry and solid. He looked at the fuel bays, stacked and marked. He did not praise Darius. He checked the vent with his good hand, feeling the airflow. He pressed his palm against the earth wall and held it there. He felt the temperature, steady, warm, held by the ground itself, fed by a small fire that did not need to fight the wind because the wind did not exist down here. Oren said, "You gave the cold nowhere to put its teeth." Merritt stood in the center of the chamber. He was the man who had said a bank hole was where a man starts, not where he lives through January. He was standing in a bank hole in January. The bank hole was warm. His ranch house was broken. His woodpile was frozen. His hand-named Foy Beecham was dead in the snow. He did not say anything. He sat down beside the stove and held his hands toward the heat, and for the first time in the 5 days of the storm, the shaking in his fingers stopped. The wind held for 2 more days. Then it died the way Kansas wind dies, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had closed a door. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. Darius opened the outer door and dug through the drift into daylight. The prairie was scraped bare in places and buried in others. The crooked L roof was visible 2 miles south, its western side torn open, the cattle panels still lashed across the gap. Wood piles across the settlement were white mounds sealed under ice, unreachable. Smoke rose from chimneys where families had burned whatever they could reach: furniture, fencing, wagon parts, anything that would fit in a firebox. Darius had burned less than 3 cords during the worst stretch. The earth had done the rest, holding warmth, blocking wind, keeping the air still so the fire could do its work without fighting the gale for every degree. 18 cords minus 3 left 15 in the bays, enough to last through spring with room to spare. But the storm was only the first test. The draw still had a second face, the one Merritt had warned about, the one Lenora had asked about, the one Judson had named when he sold the land. The dry draw was dry in winter. In spring, when the snow melted and the rain fell on frozen ground, it would fill, and the house that had swallowed the wind would have to answer the water. That question was still months away. But it was coming, and Orrin Traft, the man who had taught Darius how to think about water, was sitting against the bank wall with 2 black fingers and a rattle in his chest that sounded like the beginning of something that did not end well. The morning after the wind died, Darius dug out the entrance and stood on the prairie for the first time in 6 days. The air was still. The cold was sharp but without teeth. No wind behind it, no force pushing it through clothing and skin. The sky had gone from dirty tin to pale blue, and the sun sat low on the southern horizon, throwing long shadows across a landscape that looked like it had been attacked. The Crooked L bunkhouse roof gaped open on the west side, the cattle panels still lashed across the gap, crusted with snow. Smoke rose from chimneys across the settlement, thin and unsteady, the fires fed by whatever people had left to burn. The snow lay in strange patterns, scraped bare in some places, drifted 6 feet deep in others, the wind having rearranged the surface of the prairie according to rules that had nothing to do with human plans. Darius's roof was invisible, a smooth patch of snow-covered earth, flush with the ground, indistinguishable from the prairie around it. The only sign of life was the thin column of smoke rising from the plum brush, barely visible against the pale sky. Within 3 days, the neighbors came. Merritt Gann arrived first, on foot, because his horse had thrown a shoe during the storm and the farrier's shop was buried under a drift. He walked the 2 miles from the Crooked L with his coat buttoned wrong and his hat pulled low, and he came down the bank path slowly, the way a man moves when he is about to do something that costs him. Darius met him at the inner door. The chamber was warm, the stove banked coals, the air still and dry. Orvie Pike was sitting on the raised bed, eating porridge. Clary's fever had broken on the 5th day, and she was sleeping, her breathing quiet for the first time in weeks. Merritt stood in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. He looked at the earth walls. He looked at the sod roof overhead, the beams visible where the candle light caught them, solid and uncracked. He looked at the fuel bays, 15 cords still stacked, dry, accessible, each bay clearly marked with notches. He looked at the stove, drawing clean through the cracked firebox, the smoke rising straight up the flue without a whisper of backdraft. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 61 degrees. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of a man who had been certain and had been wrong, and knew the difference between the two. "I told you a bank hole was where a man starts," Merritt said. "I was wrong. This is where a man thinks." He said it plainly, without ceremony, and the admission cost him something visible, a tightening around his jaw, a drop in his shoulders, the posture of a man releasing a weight he had carried for months. He did not apologize. Apology would have diminished both of them. He simply corrected his own record, out loud, in front of the people who were there to hear it. Orrin Traft was leaning against the bank wall with his ruined left hand wrapped in clean cloth. He heard Merritt's words and said nothing. He did not need to. The room said everything. "How much earth over the roof?" Merritt asked. 18 inches of clay and packed dirt over sod, over hay, over brush, over poles, over 8 oak beams. "How high above the flood channel?" 6 feet. The bench sits 3 feet above the highest debris line. "The vent. How does it avoid backdraft in a gale?" "The pipe sits lower than the brush around it. Wind passes over. The intake comes through the dogleg entry, low and slow. The smoke shelf inside the flue prevents pressure reversal." Merritt listened. He asked 4 more questions. About the sump, about the drainage slope, about the door spacing, about the fuel bay ventilation. Each question was specific. Each answer was specific. This was not a man being polite. This was a foreman cataloging a method he intended to use. When he finished, Merritt said, "I'm going to send 2 hands to look at your fuel vault." The crooked L lost 8 cords of oak under the ice. 8 cords stacked in the yard, sealed in a week. Every ranch in the county stores wood the same way, stacked in the yard, open to the weather, and every blizzard does the same thing. "Send them," Darius said. "I will show them what Orrin showed me." Merritt looked at Orrin. Orrin looked at his ruined hand. Neither man said anything about the cost. Lenora Pike came the next day. She brought Pace, her older son, and she did not come to the draw rim and shout down. She came down the bank path, through the entrance, through the dogleg corridor, and stood in the living chamber with her arms crossed and her eyes moving over every surface. She touched the walls. She pressed her palm flat against the clay, the way Orrin had pressed his, feeling for damp. She found none. She crouched beside the sump pit and looked at the stone lining, the drainage angle, the dry floor beneath the raised bed. She opened the stove door and looked at the firebox crack, at the way the intake air crossed the fire. She walked the fuel vault, counting bays, knocking on cribbing posts with her knuckle, listening for hollowness. Then she said, "It is better than I thought it would be." This was Lenora's way. She did not convert with speeches. She converted with inspection. She had come expecting to find something dangerous, something she could point to and say she had been right to doubt. Instead, she found a room that was warmer than her sod lean-to, drier than her cellar, and better ventilated than any dugout she had seen in 9 years on the plains. "My wall seam leaked," she said. "During the storm, the sod joint on the east side let water through when the snow packed against it. Everything on that wall is wet. Blankets, flour, the seed corn, all of it." "How high off the floor?" 18 inches. "That is your damp line. Everything below 18 inches will wick moisture from the ground through the wall base. Everything you want dry goes above it. Your bed, your food shelf, your seed. Anything that cannot get wet sits on a raised platform or hangs from the roof beam." Lenora stared at him. "You built the bed 18 inches up." "Orrin told me to." "Before the storm. Before the first frost." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Can you show me how to cut a bank cellar beside my house? Not a full draw house, a storage cellar with a roofed fuel bay and a drainage slope." "Yes." "When?" "When the ground thaws enough to cut." That was the first request. It was not the last. Over the following 2 weeks, more than a dozen people found their way to the draw. Some came with questions: how thick the clay on the roof, how far above the flood channel, how to set a cribbing post so it braced without blocking, how to size a sump pit, how to angle a stovepipe so downdraft could not reverse the flue. Darius answered every question. He drew plans in ash on a shovel blade, scratching lines and measurements with a nail, erasing with his palm, and starting over when the design needed adjusting. He did not charge for the knowledge. He did not hoard the method. Orrin was sitting against the wall during most of these visits, his ruined hand resting on his knee, and when someone asked why Darius was sharing freely, Orrin said, "Because a trick keeps one family warm. A trade keeps 10. The measurable comparison spread through the county like the cold had spread, steadily in every direction. A frame shack on the Benkelman Road had lost its roof boards and burned through 7 cords of fuel in 6 days, leaving the family with nothing for January. Lenora's sod lean-to had kept standing but soaked at the wall seam, ruining 3 months of stored food. The Crooked L Ranch House, the largest and best-built structure in the area, had lost part of its roof, frozen its woodpile, and driven its crew to burn furniture. Darius's draw house had kept stable heat, dry fuel, and room for 6 people using less than 3 cords in the worst stretch. The numbers were not debatable. The method was not theoretical. It had been tested by the worst storm in the county's memory, and it had worked while everything around it failed. Judson Rye heard the numbers and understood them differently than everyone else. Where the neighbors heard salvation, Judson heard threat. Darius's method made Judson's land sale look like what it was, not a clever deal, but a miscalculation. The worthless draw was the most valuable piece of ground in the county. The man Judson had tried to starve out was now the man everyone came to for answers, and the beams, the fuel bays, the improvements that Judson had hoped to reclaim when Darius quit were now permanent, embedded in a structure that had proved itself stronger than any building for miles. Judson pivoted. He rode to Benkelman Crossing and told the storekeeper that Darius had used company drainage, that the spill channel Darius had cut to redirect floodwater ran across land the Crooked L claimed grazing rights on. He demanded that any neighbor who copied the design near Crooked L land pay Judson a fee for the drainage easement. The claim was thin. The land in question was open range, and drainage rights had never been asserted on unclaimed ground. But Judson had paper and Darius had none, and on the frontier, paper won arguments that facts could not settle. The threat was clear: spread the method, and Judson would find a way to make it cost. Darius had survived the storm. Now he had to survive the man who had sold him the storm's address. Orrin Traff did not recover from the blizzard the way the others did. His left hand healed badly. The two black fingers did not fall off clean. They festered, then dried, and the infection crept into the hand itself before a doctor from the county seat cut the dead tissue away in February. The surgery cost $3, paid by Merritt Gann without explanation or receipt. The pain was constant, a low burn that Orrin masked with stillness and silence, but that showed in the way he held the hand against his chest, cradling it like something broken that could not be put down. But it was the chest that worried Darius. Orrin had arrived at the Crooked L during the blizzard, soaked in snow, and stayed in the damaged bunkhouse for 2 days before reaching the drawhouse. The cold had settled into his lungs. By mid-January, he had a rattle on the exhale that sounded like paper tearing slowly. By February, the rattle was constant, and the coughing fits that accompanied it left him bent double with his good hand braced against the wall, unable to speak until the spasm passed. He still came to work. Every morning, slower than before, favoring the hand, stopping to breathe in a way that made Darius look away because watching felt like trespassing. He and Darius had become collaborators now, not teacher and student, but two men refining a design they both understood. Orrin improved the vent hood, adding a clay lip that deflected rain away from the opening while still allowing smoke to exit. Darius improved the drainage slope, steepening the grade near the entrance so meltwater cleared faster. They built a removable snow hood for the entrance, a hinged frame covered in rawhide that could be propped open in clear weather and closed during storms, preventing drift from packing against the outer door. They argued about the fuel vault ceiling. Orrin wanted it arched to distribute the earth load evenly across the cribbing posts. Darius wanted it flat for easier stacking and more volume. The argument lasted 3 days. On the first day, they drew competing designs in ash on the shovel blade. On the second day, Orrin built a small model from sticks and clay, demonstrating how an arch transfers weight to the sides rather than pushing straight down. On the third day, Darius pointed out that an arch reduces the usable height at the edges, which means shorter stacks, which means less fuel per bay. They ended with a compromise. Arched at the front where the load was heaviest and the bank face thinnest, flat at the back where the solid bank provided its own support and the full height could be used. Lenora came to observe the argument. She listened to both sides and then said, "Neither of you is thinking about the woman who has to reach the top of the stack. Arch it or flatten it, but put a step shelf on the back wall so a person under 5'6" can reach the upper bay without climbing on the wood." Orrin looked at her. Darius looked at her. She was right. They built the step shelf. Orrin's backstory came out in pieces during the work, the way a man's history surfaces through shared labor when the silence between tasks is long enough to fill. He had built bridges for the army on the Platte, not the famous ones, not the ones that carried trains, but the temporary crossings that supply wagons used during campaigns and that washed out in the spring floods and had to be rebuilt the next year. He had learned to think about water the way a trapper thinks about an animal, by studying its habits, its roots, its preferences. Water was not malicious, it was predictable. It went where the ground told it to go. If you gave it a path, it took the path. If you blocked it, it found a way around, and the way around was always the one you did not want. His wife had died of typhoid in '79 in a town near Kearney, and he had walked west afterward because west was the direction that required the least explanation. He had no children. He had no surviving family. He had tools and knowledge and a body that was wearing out, and when he saw Darius marking the load path before the cut, he saw something he recognized. Not just skill, but the habit of care that kept men alive under their own work. He He had responded to that, not to the poverty or the child or the desperation, to the competence. One evening in February, Orrin sat by the stove watching Darius teach Clary how to read the thermometer. The girl held the tin housing close to the candlelight, squinting at the mercury line, calling out numbers while Darius confirmed or corrected. Orrin watched this for a long time. Then he said, "My wife wanted children. We tried for 6 years. When she died, I thought I had lost 2 people, her and the one we never had." He paused. The stove crackled. "You are teaching that girl the way I would have taught mine. That is not a small thing to watch." Darius did not answer. There was no answer that would fit. He set another piece of elm in the stove and let the silence stand. The disagreement that mattered came in late February. Orrin wanted Darius to build a second escape shaft from the fuel vault, a narrow chimney cut through the sod roof disguised as a badger hole that would allow air and access if the main entrance buried completely. Darius wanted to use the time and labor on a second storage chamber instead, a food cache that would keep provisions above the damp line and below the frost line. "You need a way out more than you need a second room," Orrin said. "I need to feed my daughter more than I need a second door," Darius said. Orrin put down the trowel he was holding, carefully, because the bad hand could not grip, and said, "I built a bridge on the North Platte in '68. Beautiful piece. 12-span, double trussed, set on stone piers I cut myself. The colonel said it was the best field bridge he had ever seen. I did not build a cofferdam upstream because I thought the piers were strong enough. Spring flood took 7 of the 12 spans and drowned a teamster who was crossing with a powder wagon. The bridge was beautiful. The teamster was dead. Build the escape shaft." Darius built the escape shaft. The shaft came up through the sod roof behind the fuel vault, a narrow tube lined with willow stakes and covered with a flat stone that could be pushed aside from below. From the surface, it looked like a depression in the ground, the kind a badger might dig, unremarkable, invisible. From inside the fuel vault, it looked like what it was, a way out when every other way was gone. By late March, Orrin's cough had deepened into something that did not sound like recovery. He sat against the bank wall more than he worked. His breathing was audible from across the chamber, a thin, persistent rasp that accompanied every exhale. He did not complain. He did not mention it. He worked on Lenora's flood escape line, a mark cut into her bank wall showing the maximum safe water height, with the slow precision of a man who knows he is finishing something and wants it done right. His last lesson was not technical. He and Darius were sitting in the draw house, the stove banked low, the air warm, Clary asleep on the raised bed. Orrin's breathing filled the silence. "Darius," he said, "how many families in this county lost fuel in the blizzard?" "Most of them, everyone with an open woodpile." "And how many know what you know?" "Some, the ones who came to ask." "Some is not enough." Orrin looked at his ruined hand. "A secret that keeps one family warm is a trick. A secret that keeps 10 families warm is a trade worth dying with." He died on April 2nd in his half-dugout 3 miles south, alone. Darius found him the next morning, sitting in his chair beside a cold stove, the brass level on the table beside him, and his tools laid out in order on the shelf. The drawing knife, the mallet, the hand drill, the trowels, each one clean, each one placed where the next hand that reached for it would find it without looking. Darius carried the tools home in a sack and set them on the shelf in the draw house beside his own. He did not speak about Orrin for 3 days. On the 4th day, Clary asked where the old man was, and Darius said, "He finished his work." It was not enough. It was all he had. The brass level sat on the shelf beside the drawn knife and the mallet, catching the candlelight the way it had caught the October sun when Orin first set it on the beam. A 9-inch piece of brass that had found the true in every timber it touched. It would find the true in every timber Darius touched from now on. That was the kind of inheritance that did not require a will. The draw held its silence the way it always held silence, complete, enclosed, the earth absorbing sound the way it absorbed heat. But now the silence had a weight it had not carried before, and Darius felt it most in the mornings, when the bank path was empty and no one came down, it favoring a bad knee and carrying a bread heel wrapped in cloth. He did not have time to grieve the way grief demanded. The sky was changing. The air smelled different, wet, heavy, with a mineral edge that meant the frost was loosening its hold on the ground. Spring was coming, and spring in a dry draw meant water. The spring storm hit on April 9th, and it did not bring wind. It brought water. Rain fell on frozen ground for 2 days, a steady, heavy rain that could not soak into earth still locked by the last frost. The water ran. It ran off every slope into every low place, gathering speed and debris as it went. The dry draw, the feature that had protected Darius all winter, the channel that had swallowed the wind and held still air, became exactly what Judson Rye and Merritt Gann and Lenora Pike had said it would become. A river. Darius heard the water before he saw it. A low roar, distant at first, then closer, then vibrating through the bank walls. He was alone. Orin was dead. Clary was at Lenora's house, sent there the day before when Darius saw the sky and smelled the rain coming. He was alone in the draw house with 18 cords of fuel, a working stove, and every lesson Orin had taught him. The water came down the draw fast and brown, carrying cottonwood branches, fence rails, a section of someone's chicken coop, and a mud-colored foam that piled against every obstruction. It filled the lowest channel in minutes. The waterline climbed 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet above the channel bottom. The living bench sat 6 feet above the channel, 3 feet of margin. That was what Darius had built, 3 feet between the house and the flood. He did not stand and watch. He moved. First the bypass cut. Orin had shown him where to dig it. A shallow trench along the opposite bank that gave flood water a cleaner path past the entrance. Darius had cut it in November, but a winter's worth of debris had partially filled it. He grabbed the shovel and cleared the trench in 20 minutes, working in the rain, the water already ankle deep on the channel floor below him. The bypass opened and a tongue of brown water diverted into it, running past the entrance berm instead of against it. Second, the spill channel. The sloped cut around the entrance approach that Orin had designed to keep water flowing away from the door. Darius cleared a brush pile that had blown against it during the winter and watched the water obey the gradient running downhill, away from the door into the channel below. Third, the lower door. He braced it from the outside with oak stakes driven into the bank, reinforcing it against the pressure of water that might rise against it. The brace held the door shut and watertight. The upper door, the inner one, stayed open for airflow through the escape shaft. Fourth, the sump. He climbed back inside and checked the pit. Water was seeping through the floor, a slow weep, not a flood, the kind of moisture that the stone lining was designed to catch and channel to one point. He bailed it with a bucket. 1 bucket, 2, 3. The seep held steady. It was manageable. The water in the channel rose to 4 feet above the bottom, then 4.5, then 5. The living bench sat at 6, 1 foot of margin. Darius stood at the edge of the bench and watched the brown water churn below him, carrying debris at a speed that would knock a man off his feet. Fence rails, brush, a dead coyote spinning in the current. The roar filled the draw and echoed off the walls and vibrated through the floor. 1 foot. If the rain continued another day, the water might reach the bench, might reach the door, might reach the fuel bays and ruin everything the winter had preserved. The rain stopped that evening. The water crested at 5 feet 2 inches above the channel, 10 inches below the bench, and began to drop. By morning, the draw was a muddy channel again, littered with debris, the bypass cut clogged with branches, the spill channel running clear. The living chamber was dry. The fuel bays were dry. The sump held 4 inches of water that Darius bailed in 10 minutes. But a neighbor was not as fortunate. A man named Harlan Dietz, 3 miles north, had copied Darius's roof design after the blizzard, the sawed-over clay layer, the beam span, the flush profile. He had built a bank cellar in a shallow wash and stored 6 cords inside. But he had not copied the water path. He had not cut a bypass channel. He had not sloped his entrance approach. He had not built his bench above the flood line. He had built the roof and ignored the floor. The spring storm filled Harlan's cellar to the ceiling. 6 cords of fuel floated in brown water. The roof held, that was the cruel part. The roof held perfectly. It was the finest roof on a swimming pool anyone had ever built. If this story makes you think about what it means to do something right, not just the visible part, but the part nobody sees until it matters, share it with someone who builds things. Because the method was never just the roof. It was everything underneath. Judson Rye heard about Harlan's cellar and rode to Benkelman Crossing with a verdict. "Kells is teaching people to build death holes," he told the storekeeper. "The flood proves it. A man follows his plan and drowns 6 cords of winter fuel. What happens when it is not fuel in the cellar? What happens when it is children?" The argument was sharp because it was half true. The flooded cellar was a failure, but it was a failure of imitation, not design. Harlan had copied the part he could see, the roof, and ignored the part he could not see, the water management, the bench height, the bypass cut, the drainage slope. He had taken the answer without learning the question. Darius did not argue with Judson. He walked to Harlan Dietz's cellar, stood in the mud, and showed Harlan where the water had come from, where it had gone, and where it should have been sent instead. He showed him the missing bypass cut. He showed him the flat entrance that had funneled water toward the door instead of away from it. He showed him the bench, 3 feet too low, built below the debris line that anyone could read if they knew to look. "The draw is not your enemy," Darius said. "The draw is your tool, but a tool cuts the man who does not know which end to hold." Harlan rebuilt. This time he asked questions first. Lenora stood beside Darius during the inspection of Harlan's cellar. She had come not because Darius asked, but because she wanted to see how the flood had tested the method. She had her own bank cellar half cut beside her sod house, and she needed to know whether to continue or stop. She continued. But she made Darius walk her through every water management detail twice. She made her sons, Orvie and Pace, explain the drainage slope back to Darius before she allowed them to dig. She asked about the bypass cut, the bench height, the sump lining, the entrance grade. She asked about things Darius had not considered, how to keep a food shelf high enough to avoid damp, but low enough for children to reach, how to store seed corn above the moisture line, how to hang laundry in an underground room without creating condensation on the walls. She was not just learning the method, she was improving it. And the improvements came from the practical knowledge of a woman who had run a household on the prairie for 9 years. Knowledge that Darius did not have and Orrin had never thought to teach because neither of them had ever managed a kitchen, a linen supply, or a child's winter wardrobe in a space carved from dirt. Darius recognized this. He did not resist it. He let Lenora redesign the food storage layout, accepted her correction on the shelf heights, and watched her solve a ventilation problem in the fuel vault that he and Orrin had argued about for a week. She installed a removable wooden baffle at the vault entrance that could be opened for airflow during dry weather and closed for insulation during storms. It was a better solution than either man had proposed. She also taught him something Orrin never could have: how to explain the method without making pride the price of learning. Darius taught the way Orrin had taught him, through demonstration, through debate, through the assumption that the student would catch up or fail. Lenora taught differently. She told Harlan's wife how to check for damp by pressing a dry cloth against the wall and reading the stain. She showed Orvie and Pace how to test a drainage slope by pouring a cup of water on the ground and watching which direction it ran. She made the method accessible to people who did not know what a load path was and did not need to. The partnership between them was not romantic, not yet. It was built on the foundation that every durable partnership requires: mutual respect for competence that the other person possesses and you do not. Darius could build, Lenora could manage, Lenora could teach. Together they produced designs that worked not just for a solitary man in a draw, but for families with children, with stores, with livestock needs, with the 1,000 daily requirements that survival demanded and that no single person could anticipate alone. But Judson Rye still held paper. He still claimed drainage rights, and the community's gratitude toward Darius had not yet hardened into the kind of loyalty that could resist a man with a ledger and a lawyer's vocabulary. The method was spreading. The threat was spreading with it. And the winter that would test both was already building in the calendar, 8 months away, patient as the earth itself. The summer of 1886 passed in labor, and the labor had a different quality than before. In September, Darius had built to survive. Now he built to teach. The draw house was complete: living chamber, fuel vault, escape shaft, drainage system, double-door entry, hidden stovepipe. It worked. The winter had proved it. The spring had tested it. The question was no longer whether the method held. The question was whether Darius could spread it fast enough to matter before the next winter arrived. He started with Lenora's bank cellar. The two of them cut it into the earth bank beside her sod house over 3 weeks in May, working while Pace and Orvie hauled cottonwood from the creek bottom and Clary played with the Pike boy's dog in the yard. The cellar was smaller than the draw house, 10 feet by 12, with a 4-cord fuel bay attached, but it used every principle: cribbed walls, raised floor, drainage sump, sloped entrance, vent shaft, and the removable baffle Lenora had designed. Darius made Orvie and Pace explain the airflow before he let them light the stove. Orvie got it right on the second try. Pace argued that the intake should come from the vent shaft instead of the door, and Darius let him argue until Lenora said, "Try it." And Pace opened the vent cap and closed the door crack and watched the smoke back up into the room in less than a minute. He did not argue about intake again. Merritt Gann sent 2 Crooked L hands to learn how to roof a fuel vault. The ranch had rebuilt its roof after the blizzard, properly this time, with heavier timbers and iron tie-downs. But Merritt had watched 8 cords of oak freeze into a useless block during the worst storm of his career, and he was not going to let it happen again. The hands were skeptical. They were cowboys, not carpenters. They did not want to dig holes, but Merritt had sent them, and Merritt's word on the Crooked L was the same as God's word in church: debatable in theory, absolute in practice. Darius showed them the fuel vault. He showed them the cribbing, the bay markings, the sod and clay roof technique. He made them pack a test section of clay in thin layers and check it for cracks the next morning. One of the hands, a young man named Collis Fry, took to the work with the same instinct Orrin had recognized in Darius. He asked questions about load distribution and drainage angle that the other hand did not think to ask. He wanted to know why the cribbing post angled inward instead of standing plumb, and when Darius explained that the bank's own weight pressed them tighter under load, Collis nodded once and said, "Like a bridge pier that uses the current instead of fighting it." Darius looked at him and saw something familiar, a mind that understood forces, not just instructions. He spent an extra day with Collis, showing him how to read a bank face for shear risk, how to test compacted clay with a knuckle tap, how to mark a load path the way Creel had taught on the Republican River bridges. Collis went back to the Crooked L and built the first roofed fuel vault on ranch property. He set the cribbing posts himself, packed the clay in thin layers the way Darius had shown him, and lined the sump with creek stones angled for drainage. Merritt inspected it and said nothing, which on the Crooked L meant approval. When the next winter stacked ice on every exposed woodpile in the county, the Crooked L fuel vault held 9 cords of dry oak behind an earth roof that the weather could not touch. Merritt burned oak through January, while other ranches burned scrap, and he never stacked an outdoor woodpile again. By August, the knowledge was moving outward in concentric circles. Lenora taught 2 women from claims east of Benkelman Crossing how to check for damp, how to set a drainage slope, how to store food above the moisture line. Darius helped a German homesteader named Werner Pfaff cut a bank cellar on his claim, adapting the design for a shallower bank by extending the sod roof further over the open side. Merritt mentioned the fuel vault to a cattleman at the Ogallala stockyards, and the cattleman sent a rider to ask Darius for measurements. The rider arrived, wrote the numbers on a piece of brown paper, and left without paying. Darius did not ask for payment. The numbers were not his to sell. They were Orrin's, and Orrin had said what they were worth. Through all of this, Judson Rye watched. He had stopped making drainage claims after the spring flood. Harlan Dietz's flooded cellar had weakened his argument. If the method was dangerous, why was Judson claiming rights over it? If it was worthless, why was he charging fees? The contradiction exposed his position as what it was, not concern for safety, but a grab for control. The community saw through it, not because they were wise, but because they had spent the winter burning furniture while Darius counted dry cords by lantern light. Experience had made Judson's rhetoric transparent, but Judson did not build underground. He could not. To build a bank cellar or a fuel vault would be to admit that the man he had sold a grave had built a house. It would be to acknowledge that the $5 draw was worth more than the $200 ranch house roof that had torn open in the first real wind. Judson's pride was worth more to him than his safety, and on the frontier, that was a bet that Winter always collected. He stored his wood in a new shed, framed, shingled, locked, and boasted about the shingles to anyone who would listen. "I do not need to live in a hole," he told the storekeeper at Parcher's. "I have a roof that stays where I put it." The shed was well built. Judson had paid a carpenter from the county seat to frame it, and the shingles were factory-cut cedar, tight and even. It was the finest woodshed in the county. It was also above ground, with walls that the wind could press and a door that could seal shut under ice. The second winter came in November of 1886, and it came with sleet. Not the killing blizzard of the previous January. This was different. A wet, heavy storm that moved slow across the plains and laid a half-inch of ice over everything it touched. The ice arrived in layers. First, a cold rain that soaked every surface. Then a drop in temperature sharp enough to freeze the water where it sat. Then more rain on top of the freeze, building a coat of clear glass over every fence wire, every tree limb, every door hinge, every latch and lock and tool handle exposed to the sky. Fence wire coated until it sagged under the weight and snapped, the posts leaning inward like tired men. Cottonwood limbs cracked and fell across roads, blocking wagon traffic for days. The ice-sealed doors, windows, lids, latches. Anything with a joint or a seam froze shut in a layer so clear a man could see through it, and so hard he could not break it without an axe. The Crooked L fuel vault held. Collis Fry's sodden clay roof shed the ice the way it shed everything else. The water ran off the slope, froze in the drainage channel, and left the vault door accessible. Merritt Gann walked into the vault, pulled dry oak from the nearest bay, and carried it to the bunkhouse without breaking stride. The underground fuel was untouched. Lenora's bank cellar held. Her drainage slope channeled the ice melt away from the door. Her baffle stayed operable because it was recessed behind the entrance berm, sheltered from the direct ice coat. She fed her stove dry elm from the fuel bay, while ice sealed every surface of her sod house above ground. Darius's draw house was invisible under the ice, the same way it was invisible under the snow, the same way it was invisible under the grass. The entrance sat below the ice line. The fuel bays were dry. The stove drew clean. 61 degrees inside, while the temperature outside dropped to 11 below. But Judson's shed doors froze. The hinges locked. The latch sealed. 8 cords of cedar and oak sat behind a wall of ice-coated wood that Judson could not open with his hands, could not pry with a bar because the bar itself was frozen to the tool rack, could not chop through because the axe head was inside the shed. The ice storm did not care about factory-cut shingles. It treated Judson's shed the same way the blizzard had treated every outdoor woodpile in the county. It sealed it shut and waited. The temperature dropped to 11 below on the second night of the storm. Judson's house, a proper frame house with glass windows and a shingled roof, held its roof. But without fuel, the house was a box with walls that bled heat into the dark. His wife's sister had arrived from Dodge City with 2 children, visiting for the month, and the 4 of them, Judson, his wife, her sister, and 2 children under 6, sat in a house that was dropping 1 degree every hour. Judson tried to break into the shed. He swung a fence post against the door and cracked the ice, but not the door. He tried the window. The glass broke, but the frame held, and the opening was too small to pull a full log through. He reached in and grabbed a split round, small enough to fit, and carried it inside. 1 round. Maybe 20 minutes of heat. He burned the round. The house warmed for 20 minutes, and then the heat bled through the walls, and the stove went cold, and the room returned to the same dropping temperature it had held before. The children cried. His wife's sister wrapped them in every blanket in the house and sat with her back against the cooling stove, feeding it pieces of a chair that Judson broke apart with his hands. The chair burned for 15 minutes. The bookshelf burned for 10. Each piece of furniture bought a fraction of an hour, and each fraction ended the same way. The fire dying, the cold returning, the room dropping another degree toward a number that would make sleeping dangerous for a child. At 9 o'clock that night, with the house at 34 degrees and the children wrapped in every piece of fabric the household owned, Judson Rye walked to the draw. He came without his hat. One cheek was white with frost, the waxy, numb white that meant the skin was dying and would blister black by morning. His coat was unbuttoned because his fingers could not work the buttons. His boots were glazed with ice from the walk. He came down the bank path the way Merritt had come down it after the blizzard, slowly, with the weight of a man doing something that cost him everything he had left to spend. Darius was sitting by the stove with Clary and Lenora. The draw house was 61 degrees. The fuel bays held 12 cords. The stove drew clean. The sump was dry. The air was still and warm and smelled of elm coals and dried clay. Judson stood in the doorway. He did not knock. He did not speak. He stood there with his white cheek and his unbuttoned coat and looked at the room he had called a coffin, the room he had tried to starve into abandonment, the room whose fuel bays he had tried to claim, whose method he had called a death hole, whose builder he had mocked for a year and a half in every store and stable in the county. Darius looked at him. "I have 4 people in my house," Judson said. "2 of them are children. The woodshed is frozen shut. The stove is cold." He did not ask, he stated. Asking would have required a word he could not say, please or help, or the worst one, the one that would have broken him entirely. I was wrong. Darius did not make him say it. He did not bargain. He did not remind Judson of the $5 deed, or the coffin remark, or the scrap lumber purchase, or the drainage claim, or the death holes. He stood up, put on his coat, and said, "Bring them." Judson brought them. His wife, her sister, the 2 children, all of them cold, all of them frightened, all of them stepping down into the draw house with the disbelief of people entering a place they had been told did not work. The children stopped crying when the warmth hit them. The sister sat on the raised bed and pressed her hands against the earth wall and said, "It is warm." Judson sat beside the fuel bays, the same fuel bays he had once tried to claim as recoverable improvements, the same wood he had tried to line for unpaid debt. He sat there for a long time, looking at the notches marking each cord, at the cribbing posts bracing the bank, at the clay roof overhead holding the weight of the prairie without cracking. Then he said, "I sold you a flood." Darius said, "You sold me a question." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that exists between 2 men when the truth has been spoken and neither one needs to add to it. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. It was the recognition that pride had nearly killed 4 people, and that the man pride had tried to destroy was the man who opened the door when pride came crawling. Lenora gave the children porridge. Darius stoked the fire. Judson sat in the draw house through the night and did not sleep and did not speak, and in the morning, when the ice began to thaw and the shed door finally broke open, he gathered his family and climbed the bank path without looking back. He never mocked the draw again. He never built underground either. Some conversions do not change a man's behavior, only his silence. Judson Rye's silence, from that night forward, was the loudest admission the county ever heard. He paid the back taxes on the adjacent section and signed over the grazing access to the Crooked L without charging a fee. And whether this was guilt or calculation or some mixture of both that Judson himself could not have named, the effect was the same. The paper threat he had held over Darius's method dissolved like ice in April, quietly, without ceremony, leaving nothing behind but wet ground. By 1889, the method had taken root in the soil and in the habits of the people who worked it. 3 draw houses used Darius's principles: full underground chambers with earth roofs, cribbed walls, drainage systems, and protected fuel bays. 2 of the 3 had been built by people Darius had taught directly. The 3rd had been built by Collis Fry on land he had claimed after leaving the Crooked L, using measurements he had written on the same piece of brown paper the stockyard rider had carried, plus corrections he had learned through his own mistakes. A roof section that sagged because the clay layers were too thick, a drainage slope that pooled because the grade was too gentle, a cribbing post that shifted because the floor socket was too shallow. Collis fixed each mistake and documented the fix, and when a new homesteader asked him for advice, he gave the mistake first and the correction second, which was the best way to teach anything because it made the lesson stick. 6 bank fuel vaults dotted the claims around Benkelman Crossing, each one roofed with sod and clay, each one holding between 4 and 10 cords of dry wood through the worst weather. The vaults varied in design. Some followed Darius's original layout exactly, Some used Lenore's baffle system, some adapted Collis's modifications, but all of them shared the core principle. Fuel stored underground or under earth cover, protected from wind and ice, accessible in any weather. A school cellar on the crossing road used the dogleg entry design and the removable baffle for ventilation, doubling as a storm shelter during spring weather. The school board had paid Darius $8 and Pace Pike $4 for 2 weeks of labor, and it was the largest fee Darius had ever received for his work. The settlement still built frame houses when money allowed. Frame houses were respectable. Frame houses had windows and paint and the social approval that came with visible prosperity. But every sensible family now stored at least part of its fuel under cover or below grade, and every new cellar included a drainage slope, a sump pit, and a vent system based on what Darius and Orrin had built in the draw. The method had become part of the county's vocabulary, not celebrated, not famous, but present. The way a good habit becomes present, so embedded in practice, that the people who used it no longer remembered learning it. Darius and Lenora married after the harvest of 1887 on a Tuesday in the sod church at Benkelman Crossing, with Merritt Gann and Pace Pike standing witness and Clary holding a bunch of prairie sage she had picked from the draw rim that morning. The wedding was not a rescue. It was not a man saving a woman or a woman redeeming a man. It was two people who had spent a year building things together, deciding to continue building things together, legally, with a shared claim and a shared roof and a shared understanding that neither one could do alone what they did better in combination. Their first argument as a married couple was about the entrance. Lenora wanted a wider dogleg corridor so she could carry a bushel basket through without turning sideways. Darius said a wider corridor would lose the wind-blocking effect. Lenora said if she had to turn sideways every time she carried winter squash underground, she would leave the squash in the yard and let it freeze. Darius widened the corridor by 8 inches and angled the second turn more sharply to compensate. The wind-blocking held. The squash came through. It was the pattern of their partnership in miniature, his precision adjusted by her practicality, his engineering corrected by her experience, and neither one willing to concede a point without evidence. Lenora moved her household to the draw. She brought her boys, her stores, her seed corn, her opinions, and a rocking chair that did not fit through the dogleg even after the widening, which she placed in the frame house they later built above ground, and which became the household's one concession to above-ground comfort. Darius added the second chamber he had planned. The food cache Orrin had argued against in favor of the escape shaft, and Lenora organized it with the efficiency of a woman who had fed 3 people on a widow's margin for 4 years. She kept a ledger of stores that was more precise than any document Judson Rye had ever filed at the county office. She knew to the pound how much flour they had, to the quart, how much lard, to the cord, how much fuel. When Darius estimated, Lenora counted. When Darius guessed at a measurement, Lenora pulled out the brass level and checked. The household grew. Orvie and Pace became Darius's crew, hauling wood, cutting cribbing posts, packing clay. They were not his sons by blood, but they learned his methods the way sons learn methods, through proximity and repetition and the slow accumulation of competence that comes from watching a man do careful work every day for years. Pace became a better carpenter than Darius by the time he was 18, with steadier hands and a patience for finish work that Darius had never possessed. He built a tool chest with dovetail joints so tight they did not need glue, and he kept Orrin's draw knife in the top tray, sharpened to a polish that Orrin himself would have approved. Orvie never took to carpentry but learned the water management, the drainage slopes, the bypass cuts, the sump systems. With an instinct that Orrin would have recognized, He could read a bank face for sheer risk faster than Darius could, and by the time he was 16, he was grading drainage slopes for neighbors without supervision. A daughter arrived in 1889, a girl they named Etta after Darius's first wife, a name Lenora suggested, and Darius accepted without speaking for a long time. The baby slept in the draw house her first winter, on the raised bed that Darius had built for Clary 4 years earlier, and the air that kept her lungs clear was the same still, warm air that had saved her half-sister's life in the blizzard of '86. Lenora taught the women. She explained the method without the technical vocabulary that intimidated people who had never handled a level or a draw knife. She told them where damp came from and how to stop it. She showed them how a candle flame could test draft, how a wet cloth pressed to a wall could find a seep, how a cup of water poured on a slope could prove whether the drainage worked. She made the knowledge accessible to anyone willing to learn, regardless of whether they could read a plan or swing an axe. She became the better teacher, not because she knew more than Darius, but because she knew what it was like to not know, and she remembered the fear that accompanied ignorance, and she never made that fear the price of asking. When a homesteader's wife named Ada Motz came to the draw house in the autumn of '88, terrified of another winter in a leaking sod house with 3 children, Lenora did not show her a plan. She walked Ada through the draw house room by room, letting her touch the walls, feel the air, sit beside the stove, and understand with her body what her mind had not yet grasped. That warmth could be held, that damp could be stopped, that the earth was not an enemy but a partner if you treated it right. Ada went home and told her husband to dig, and by November the Motz family had a bank cellar with a 2-cord fuel bay and a drainage slope that Ada had graded herself using a cup of water and a kitchen sense that no engineer could have taught her. Darius earned fees cutting bank cellars, setting beams, and teaching winter storage. He was never wealthy. The fees were small: a sack of flour, a day's use of a team, occasionally a few dollars in coin. He did not chase money. He chased the work. Every cellar he cut, every vault he roofed, every drainage slope he graded was another family that would not burn furniture in January, another woodpile that would not freeze into a useless block, another set of children who would sleep warm while the wind tore the surface of the prairie apart. He kept Orrin's tools on the shelf beside his own: the draw knife, the mallet, the hand drill, the trowels. He used Orrin's brass level on every job. The bubble still floated true. When a beam sat plumb and the level confirmed it, Darius sometimes paused with his hand on the brass casing and stood still for a moment, and anyone watching would have thought he was checking the reading. He was not checking the reading. He was remembering a man who had walked down a bank path on an October morning and seen something in his work worth staying for. Clary survived her childhood cough. The draw house air, warm, still, humidified by the steam pot on the stove, eased her lungs through the winters that would have killed her in the open. She grew into a quiet, precise girl who kept count of everything: cords of wood, pounds of flour, degrees on the thermometer, days until spring. She learned to read from a primer Lenora bought at the crossing store, and she learned to count from the notched sticks she had kept since the first week in the draw, the same sticks she had scratched marks into while sitting on a wagon seat in September, tracking rounds of cottonwood that were not stacking fast enough. By 1892, she was teaching at the crossing school, 17 years old, standing in front of children whose parents had once thrown stones into the draw for sport. She taught arithmetic with the confidence of someone who had learned numbers not from a textbook, but from the gap between what her family had and what they needed, and the children listened because she never pretended the numbers were abstract. She kept Orrin's level and plumb bob in the classroom cupboard. When a student asked what they were for, she said, "For finding the truth in things that look crooked." It was the kind of answer Orrin would have given, delivered without ornament, meant to be understood later. Merritt Gann retired from the Crooked L in 1891 with 3 fingers stiff from the frost he had taken during the blizzard, and a reputation for being the only foreman in the county who had ever admitted he was wrong in public. He told younger cowboys to listen before they laughed, and when they asked what he meant, he said, "There was a man who built a house in a ditch, and I told him he would die in it, and he kept warm while I burned my chair." Darius never painted the house he eventually built above the draw, a simple frame structure, small, with a porch facing south and windows that let in the winter light. He said paint was for boards that had something to prove. The real house was underground. The frame house was where Lenora hung laundry, and where Clary did homework, and where the boys cleaned their boots before going down the bank path to the draw house, which remained the household's winter quarters, storm shelter, fuel store, and root cellar for the rest of Darius's life. He died in 1912 during an ordinary autumn, not in a storm, not in a flood, not in any of the dramatic ways the frontier had tried to kill him. He died in bed, in the frame house, with Lenora beside him and Clary's hand on his, and outside the window the wind was blowing the way it always blew across western Kansas, constant, indifferent, pressing against every surface it could find. They buried him on the rise above the draw, where the wind could reach him at last. Within 5 winters, more than a dozen families in Cheyenne County had copied some part of Darius Kells's method. Not all built full draw houses. Some only roofed a fuel vault. Some added a dogleg storm entry to an existing cellar. Some raised floors in bank dugouts and cut proper drainage for the first time. The spread was not the exact structure, but the principle underneath it. Keep the wind off the body. Keep water away from the walls. Keep fuel where the storm cannot bury it. Lenora Pike Kells taught more of them than Darius did, and the ones she taught remembered the lessons longer because she never made them feel foolish for asking. Darius Kells lived out his life above the same dry draw he bought for $5 in September of 1885. He never moved. He never sold. The draw house settled into the earth over the decades, its sod roof greening over until it was indistinguishable from the prairie around it, its beams darkening with age, its fuel bays still dry, still usable, still holding the still air that had saved his daughter's life in the first winter and sheltered his enemy's children in the second. Clary grew up remembering winters not by fear, but by the sound of oak coals settling behind an earthen wall, a sound like a house breathing. Kells bought a flood and called it a house. That was what Judson Rye had said in Parcher's store in October of 1885, and the county had laughed, and the laughter had followed Darius into the draw like stones thrown by children. In January, the flood did not come. The wind came. It came at 30 below with a force that tore roofs and froze woodpiles and killed a man 60 yards from his own hay barn. The men with money burned furniture. The men with shingles burned chairs. The man in the draw counted dry cords by lantern light, and the flame in his stove never bent, and his daughter slept warm on a raised bed while the prairie above them screamed. Then, in April, the flood did come, brown and fast and carrying everything it could lift, and the house still stood because Darius had never trusted the draw. He had respected it. He had listened to what the earth was telling him and built accordingly, and the earth had answered with the only currency it knew: stillness, warmth, and time. The grass grew over the roof until the shelter vanished from the prairie, until there was nothing left to see but one thin stovepipe hidden in plum brush and a path worn into the bank. A path made first by a man who came to laugh, and then by a man who came to learn, and then by everyone else.